The wooden auction block stood tall in the middle of the dusty street, its boards cracked and splintered from years of use. The crowd had gathered early, spilling out of the saloon doors and leaning against posts along the general store, their voices rising in a restless murmur. It wasn't cattle being sold today, nor horses, nor land, it was people, the kind the world had forgotten, women with no family left, no coin, and nowhere to go. The sun beat down harshly, making the air shimmer with heat, but the shiver that ran through those lined up on the platform had nothing to do with the weather. She stood among them, wrists bound loosely in front of her, a faded dress clinging to her slight frame. Her hair, tangled from the long ride into town, framed a face both too young and too weary for its years. Her chin lifted every now and then as though to remind herself she hadn't broken completely, but her eyes betrayed her. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and learned not to hope. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the crowd, slick with greed. "Step right up, gentlemen. Fine stock here, strong backs, willing hands." He clapped his hands and motioned her forward. She stumbled to the edge of the platform, blinking against the glare. A hush fell as the men sized her up. She wasn't what they might call prime pickings. She looked half-starved, her frame fragile beneath the worn cloth. But there was something in the tilt of her head, in the faint fire behind her exhaustion, that made her stand apart. "Who'll start me off?" the auctioneer barked. $5, 3, 2, his words rang out, but no hands rose. Some in the crowd laughed under their breath, shaking their heads. She wasn't worth much, not in their eyes. The auctioneer's lip curled in disdain. $1 then, just one measly dollar for a pair of working hands. Don't tell me you men got soft. Still, silence hung thick in the air. Men shifted on their boots, some whispering crude jokes, others spitting tobacco into the dirt. The girl's chest rose and fell as if each second of waiting weighed on her shoulders. The longer she stood there, the clearer it became that no one wanted her. No one except perhaps to mock, or worse. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice spoke. $1. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like the crack of a whip. Heads turned to see him, broad-shouldered, weathered from years under the sun, hat pulled low enough to cast shadow over his eyes. The rancher. Everyone knew him, though not well. He lived alone at the far edge of the prairie, kept to himself, came into town only when absolutely necessary. Rumors swirled about him, some said he'd lost his family to sickness, others that he'd chosen solitude out of bitterness. Whatever the truth, no one called him a man who sought company. The auctioneer squinted, then smirked. $1. Sold, I suppose. Ain't no one else wants her. He slammed the gavel down with a sharp crack, sealing the deal as laughter rippled through the crowd. The girl froze, her breath catching in her throat. Just like that, she belonged to someone else. She was led down from the block, her steps unsteady, the weight of resignation pressing hard against her chest. The murmurs of the townsfolk followed her, mocking, curious, pitying. When she reached him, she dared to lift her eyes. He looked down at her, his face unreadable, carved from the same stone as the hills beyond town. She swallowed, her voice trembling as the words escaped before she could stop them. "Please, just make it quick." The crowd chuckled darkly at her plea, assuming they knew what she meant. After all, men who bought women didn't waste time. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to them. Instead, he took off his long coat, rough but warm, and placed it around her shoulders. The gesture startled her so much that for a moment she forgot to breathe. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice low enough for her alone. The whispers behind them swelled, questions, jokes, disbelief. A man spends $1 for a woman and doesn't claim her on the spot. It was unheard of, but the rancher ignored them, guiding her gently away from the platform, through the crowd, and toward his waiting wagon. Her legs moved as if in a dream. Each step away from that block should have lightened her, but confusion and fear tangled inside her chest. Why had he done it? Why buy her only to cover her shoulders and speak kindly? She clutched the coat tighter, its weight heavy yet strangely comforting, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of something she'd thought lost forever, uncertainty about what came next. Behind them, the laughter of the town faded into the wind. Ahead lay only the open road, the rancher's silent stride, and the unanswered question burning in her heart: what did this man really want with her? The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled over the uneven trail, the sound of iron against rock echoing in the empty prairie. She sat on the wooden seat beside the rancher, his coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of leather, dust, and something she could not name, something steady and familiar. She kept her hands clutched to the fabric as though it were the only barrier between her and the unknown. The town had vanished behind them, its noises replaced by the lonely call of a hawk overhead and the creak of harness leather. She dared not speak. Every time she shifted, she half expected him to glance her way with the cold authority of someone who had bought and paid for her. But he didn't. His eyes stayed forward, his hands firm on the reins, guiding the horses up toward the hills where the land stretched wild and untamed. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had begun to settle, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. The house was plain, built of rough-hewn timber, its roof sagging slightly, the porch weathered from years of storms. A few fence posts lined the property, and beyond them the earth rolled out into endless grassland. It wasn't much, but it carried the weight of a place that had stood alone against time and wind. He pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down. She waited, uncertain if she should follow. He looked at her then, just a glance, but his tone left no room for misunderstanding. "Come on." Her boots hit the ground, sending up a small puff of dust. She kept her eyes lowered, nerves twisting in her stomach. The coat was too large for her, and its hem brushed against her legs as she trailed behind him up the porch steps. He opened the door, and the faint smell of smoke and old pine wood met her nose. Inside, the cabin was spare but tidy. A table and 2 chairs stood in the corner, a stove squatted near the far wall, and a narrow bed rested under the single window. Everything was neatly arranged, the marks of a man who lived alone and had long grown used to silence. He set his hat on a peg by the door, then moved to light a lantern. Warm light filled the room, casting shadows that flickered along the walls. "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair by the table. His voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't gentle either, it carried the weight of a man unused to company. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair, her fingers twisting in her lap. Every muscle in her body was taut, waiting for what she believed must come. When he moved to the stove, she finally found her voice, though it shook. "Aren't you going to?" she faltered, unable to finish the sentence, the shame of the words burning in her throat. He turned, looking at her squarely. His face was unreadable, shadowed by the lantern light, but his eyes held no cruelty. "No," he said simply. Her breath caught. "But you paid for me." "I paid to keep you from them," he answered, turning back to the pot on the stove. His shoulders were broad, the movements of his hands steady as he lifted the lid, stirred, and ladled out something steaming. "Not for what you think." She didn't realize she was crying until the tears rolled hot down her cheeks. She brushed them away quickly, embarrassed by her weakness. He placed a bowl in front of her, the smell of stew rising with its warmth. "Eat," he said. "You need it." Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The first taste nearly broke her. It wasn't just food, it was kindness, and she hadn't tasted either in far too long. She forced herself to eat slowly, each bite grounding her in the strange reality of this cabin, this man, this unexpected turn of fate. He didn't sit across from her. Instead, he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the fire in the stove as though it carried the answers to questions he didn't want to ask out loud. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the cruel silence she had known before. It was a silence that held space, not threat. When the bowl was empty, she set it down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the fire. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, his voice rumbled, low and rough. "Because I know what it feels like, to be left with nothing. To be treated like you don't matter. And I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Her heart clenched at his words. No one had ever said she mattered. Not really, not in a way that felt real. He turned then, meeting her eyes. There was no softness in his expression, but there was no cruelty either. "Just truth. You'll stay here until you figure out what you want. The choice is yours, but while you're under this roof, you're safe. That's all you need to know." The tears returned, but this time she didn't hide them. She let them fall silently, her shoulders shaking with the release of years of fear and exhaustion. He didn't move to comfort her, didn't reach out or speak further. He just let her be, and somehow, that was more merciful than any touch could have been. As the night deepened and the prairie wind howled against the walls, she lay awake in the small bed he'd given her, the firelight flickering across the ceiling. For the first time in years, her body was not braced for violence, her spirit not chained to despair. And though she could not name it yet, She understood that the unthinkable thing he had done was not buying her for $1, it was giving her back something she thought she had lost forever, the right to be human again.